We help organizations save money and be more secure in the cloud, in the public cloud. We hit our first $1 million in revenue like 7 months after the product launch. And then, oh, by the way, this may be shocking, but when we did our initial product launch, it was very aggressive. Like parts of our product weren't, fully smoothed out. You can DIY, like open source is free like a puppy, right? You still have to do the care, feeding, training, and you've got to do that for the entire lifetime of that puppy, right? May have been free to start with, but there's still a lot of work and investment involved in that. We hit our first $1 million in revenue like 7 months after the product launch. And then, oh, by the way, this may be shocking, but when we did our initial product launch, it was very aggressive. Like parts of our product weren't fully smoothed out. We can be one of those iconic, venerable type technology companies. That's the size and scale of our opportunity.
Welcome back to the Middle Tech Podcast. You got Logan Jones here, joined by Evan Knowles today. And we sat down with Travis Stanfield, who is the co-founder and CEO of Stacklet. So Stacklet is a very interesting and technical company building governance as a service, governance in cloud infrastructure for large organizations that host their software in the cloud. So obviously that is something that not many of us are super familiar with. So the conversation does take some deep dives into exactly how they do what they do. Very interesting company as is being built here in Kentucky, but it is a fully remote company. So Travis started the company right as the COVID pandemic was getting ramped up. So there are all sorts of interesting dynamics in his story around how he fundraised for that company, how he built the company fully remote, the dynamics of operating a team fully remotely. And Travis also lives on a horse farm and runs this entire company. So it's a very interesting kind of Kentucky lifestyle that he gets to live through being the co-founder and CEO of Stacklet. So we hope you guys enjoy the conversation. Before we dive into this, we just want to get a quick word from our sponsors. Before highlighting our sponsors, we'd just like to state that the views and content shared on this platform do not necessarily reflect those of our show sponsors. Middle Tech is presented by KY Innovation, the Kentucky Cabinet for Economic Development's Office of Entrepreneurship. KY Innovation exists to support and develop Kentucky's startup ecosystem, and we are proud to be supported by an organization whose mission aligns so closely with ours. If you're a founder building in Kentucky, you need to check out the resources that KY Innovation has to offer. You can find more information by clicking the link in our show notes or going to kyinnovation.com. Middle Tech is sponsored by Bolt Marketing. Take your website to the next level with a website that's built to work. At Bolt Marketing, they're revolutionizing websites for small businesses that are affordable, customizable, and hassle-free. Whether you have a construction company, a boutique clothing store, or you own a hot yoga studio, they have options for you. Click the link in our show notes to explore their marketing options that can transform your marketing and grow your business. And as a personal note, Bolt Marketing built our website, and they were awesome to work with throughout the entire process. We highly recommend working with. Middle Tech is also supported by Huntsicker, an impact venture studio based in Lexington, Kentucky. Huntsicker is creating companies out of the ordinary by founding and funding the next generation of purpose-driven startups. They partner with founders to create indispensable solutions to the world's most fundamental problems. On a quarterly basis, they host an invite-only intimate gathering called Fireside Convos, where attendees representing a wide network of stakeholders in the regional entrepreneurial ecosystem discuss timely topics, including the role of AI for startups out of Kentucky and the challenges of identifying and attracting talent. To be considered as a guest, visit huntsicker.co/fireside to apply. All right, we are here with Travis Stanfield, who's the founder and CEO of Stacklet. Travis, we got to meet for the first time actually in the space that we're recording in. Shout out to Huntsicker. They put on the Fireside Convos. We had a fireside conversation about the dynamics of fundraising in Kentucky versus the coast. And it was the first time I got to meet you. So it was really cool to meet you there. You have a very interesting story that we're looking forward to diving into today.
Yeah, thank you, Logan. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk a little bit more about all things tech in Kentucky.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to start things off, calling out that you were a graduate of the University of Kentucky, go Cats. So let's start there. After graduating UK, you ended up in big tech. So you ended up with Microsoft.
Yep.
And when we got coffee, you were telling me a little bit about that story and how you ended up there. So I think it's always interesting to hear the story of how somebody ends up at a company like that. So
Sure.
just kind of talk us through how that came to be.
Yeah, a little bit by luck, they were recruiting on campus. This was, at the risk of dating myself, late 90s. And at that time, Microsoft was still, Bill Gates was the CEO. So it was, call it like the glory days, perhaps, of actually the company's doing very well even today.
Right.
But when you think about it in like its heaviest growth kind of phase, that's when you start talking about like Windows 95, Windows 98, that sort of thing. So they came looking for folks in computer science and related backgrounds, which is where I studied, and went to the campus interview session that they had. It was kind of like a bit of an open call or open audition, and I got called back and went through the recruiting process and was successful at getting my first job there. So, and that was actually when I started there. I moved out to like the Redmond area, Bellevue, to actually work there. So that was first time that I wasn't a Kentucky resident and was there basically for about 4 years. So,
Was that a goal of yours to go work on the coast or for a large tech company, or did that just so happen to kind of land in your lap?
kind of landed in my lap.
Yeah.
I think my preference, I'm from Kentucky originally. My preference was at least to stay here, but also when opportunity and adventure knocked, right, I was excited, especially at a young age, to take that leap, and that's what I did.
What made you want to do computer science? And while you're at UK, I'm sure the computer science and the engineering schools have evolved a lot since then. So what did it look like when you were at UK studying that?
Yeah, good questions. So honestly, I started into computers because was into video games, was into like my first computer was like a Commodore 64, again, dating myself, and like, tinkering with that, writing programs, taking it apart, getting it fixed. Sometimes I could do that by myself. Sometimes I needed help, but it was just a place where I had a lot of curiosity towards, in terms of like, the maybe the difference in computer science from then to now. I mean, we were very, very heavily like algorithm focused, C++, assembler language, bare metal type stuff. The internet was just starting to kind of come to fruition. So, the networking classes and that sort of thing, I think, were a little bit more, in a good way, focused on fundamentals. And, it was, I think, actually a really good time because it taught me a lot of like, call it like concrete types of practices and principles that are still very applicable today, just obviously a lot more layers of abstraction and interesting advancements since then. So.
And how did your career begin to evolve after Microsoft? So you hit a couple different spots. You ended up back at Microsoft for a little bit. Kind of talk us through some of the highlights of your career prior to starting Stacklet.
Yeah, totally. I mean, well, it was largely personal decision in so much as I was still dating my wife, who I met at UK, even while I was, at Microsoft. So we kind of hit a place where we were like, hey, I either move you out west or I move back to Kentucky. And since my roots are here, it made a lot more sense for me to kind of come back here. But the technology scene here is not as call it vibrant, right? And there aren't as many in terms of like volume opportunities. So I actually started looking just in like adjacent areas. And one of the guys that I contacted, who was like the CIO of a startup in Long Island, he basically said, hey, like, we'll work it out if you want to live in Kentucky part of the time and work here part of the time. So that startup was called DealerTrack. And I took that job and did, call it like hypercommute, half here, half there, or often for a couple of years, I would go to Toronto to help with some of the M&A and subsidiary type stuff that they had going on there. So still a Kentucky resident, but spent a lot of time elsewhere for career-related purposes. Actually went back to Microsoft for a bit. I was like, again, field consultant, doing a lot of travel, servicing, tier one investment banks in the New York, New England area. So Merrill and Fidelity being two that I spent a lot of time with. And then did a couple other startups. Actually also took a fairly local gig in Frankfurt for several years. That was like, a time when I was fully off the road, fully like, in Kentucky. And certainly, at least in terms of Stacklet or leading to that, a friend of mine recruited me there to Capital One, where my co-founder and I come from, and was basically like, hey, it's not really a bank, it's more of a technology company. I was like, a little bit skeptical, but I went through the recruiting process and found that he was 100% right. They were very tech forward. They had already embraced like innovation, even though ostensibly they seem like a, Fortune 500 or different type of company. They were really tech forward. So, and that was, like I said, where I met my co-founder, and we started Stacklet about 4 years ago. So.
Yeah. Citi is known as one of the OGs in fintech and really being one of at the forefront of all of that. What kind of parts of the technology were you focused on within Citigroup and then Microsoft even before you got there that began to lead to what you're doing now?
Well,
Capital One.
Capital One.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So at Capital One, again, because it was focused on innovation, one of the things that they were looking to do was actually commercialize some of the technology that they had or were looking to build in-house. So my charter was to help, or was part of a team that was trying to help turn the big bank into a big technology company. So now they actually have like Capital One software where they've got, commercial products that they are selling in a line of business that sits alongside like what they do with, retail financial services and credit card and, automotive and some of their other lines of business. So did that answer the question?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good segue to get into talking about what you're building at Stacklet. Just because you kind of sounds like you face the problem that you're now solving while at Capital One.
Yeah.
So I always like starting at the most basic level when talking about somebody's company. And the question I like to ask is, how would you describe what you do to your mom?
Yeah, I say really high level, we help organizations save money and be more secure in the cloud, in the public cloud. Now, she doesn't really know what the public cloud is, but that's harder.
Gets closer.
But it's like, certainly for folks that aren't familiar with public cloud, right? These are essentially services offered by Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, that sort of thing, as opposed to, physical hardware having to build and provision all of those things. You can just run compute workloads, storage type stuff as a service in a more economic way, or at least it should be more economic way. We'll get into that, I think, here in a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, a very important type of service, especially if you're talking about fintech and banking and people's money.
Yeah.
So talk about specifically the problem that you identified.
Sure.
So it sounds like it was identified while you're at Capital One.
Yeah.
So just kind of talk us through that story and the problem that was being solved there.
Yeah, totally. So Capital One made an executive decision several years ago that they were going to go all in on public cloud, and because they saw that it was going to be a differentiator for all organizations, right? Cloud is the foundation for AI. So if you want AI, you've got to do, to a large degree, I mean, there are some exceptions to that statement, but to a large degree, you've got to do public cloud, and you got to do it really well and efficiently and securely. So they were pushing strongly, right, to move out of physical data centers and embrace public cloud. But what they hit was, call it like a little bit of a challenge with the need to apply controls and to scale those controls, right? So it's easier to adopt. It's something else to basically say, okay, well, we need to make sure that everything that we are building and using is aligned to our best practices, right? And those best practices can be, let's say, security or compliance related, right? If you're a top 10 U.S. financial institution like Capital One is, you've got a high bar in terms of regulatory scrutiny, right? That you need to be able to demonstrate to auditors that you have control at all times, not just at a point in time. And so that's one challenge that they faced. And certainly as it relates to cost, right? If you're not, let's say, turning things off, right? All of our parents taught us when you leave the room, turn the lights off to save money, right? But now teach that to hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or of developers that are in your organization as they're, let's say, self-servicing on infrastructure to run the workloads that are at the heart of the business problem that they're trying to address and are hyper-focused on. So, getting all of those things, those best practices, the efficiency best practices, the security and compliance best practices at scale, right, is a very difficult problem, right? Those developers are, again, they're often focused elsewhere, right? Their incentives may be to, continue to adopt, continue to ship, to continue to work towards the innovation and not towards, the compliance, the efficiency, the control aspects. So in the way they took, at least initially, was what a lot of organizations do. Hey, let's create like some admin scripts to go figure out whether things are aligned to our, standards or not. And if they're not, then let's go, perhaps manually fix that or use more scripts to address that. And really the innovation was, hey, all of those scripts represent undifferentiated lift, right? And what essentially it started with is an open source project called Cloud Custodian. That's a domain specific language that essentially abstracts, and DSLs are inherently like a productivity lift for developers, right? They abstract out all the underpinnings of like the cloud specific APIs, and they give you a nice, elegant language to write your policies, your best practices that will essentially ensure that the web environment or the cloud environment that you're running your workloads in are perpetually aligned to those controls or those best practices. So what this does is it gives you a declarative experience around cloud. You're designing the end state inclusive of all the things that must be true at all times. And if something goes out of bounds, you've codified the graceful course correction, right? You can bring it back in line to your best practices. And that's actually less risky than taking the manual approach that, or the scripted approach that also was maybe inefficient in that regard. So this went from, a Cited Desk project. My co-founder is the creator, and it was, Cited Desk for him. And then it got adopted very widely at Capital One very rapidly because of how effective the solution was at addressing this problem. And certainly the project got open source at this point, probably about 7-8 years ago, and went widespread, right? Real organizations pulling it off the shelf to solve real world problems for themselves. That's always a great indicator that you've got a good thesis and solution towards, solving something that means that is very meaningful for folks. So
talk about how you take an open source project and begin to build a for-profit business around it. That's a transition that, I'm curious to hear how that works.
Yeah. So I would start off by saying we're a little bit in a more beneficial spot than maybe our forefathers who had to tackle that same type of paradigm or that same type of challenge. There were some folks that we've met on this journey and that we've learned about through, other reading and media and that sort of thing, where they'll tell stories about 20 years ago when people thought that there was no opportunity to monetize around open source. Oh, you've already given it away for free. How can you possibly then charge? And a couple of things happen. There's like I think an internet truism where the more you give something away, the more valuable it becomes, right? And also what a lot of our forefathers have done is basically come up with different monetization models around open source. So if people are using your open source, you've already got, adoption, right? And if they're using it in non-trivial ways, you've got product market fit, right? Now, our commercialization model, we feel like it has been now repeated and vetted, right? And it's pretty simple. You can DIY, like open source is free like a puppy, right? You still have to do the care, feeding, training, and you've got to do that for the entire lifetime of that puppy, right? May have been free to start with, but there's still a lot of work and investment involved in that. What we do in terms of the commercial model is say, hey, you can continue to DIY. We're going to produce the SaaS, right? The managed experience, the managed accelerated experience to get the most value out of the open source for the lowest total cost of ownership. And where you see this reflected, like in analogous ways, are what Databricks is to Spark, what Confluent is to Kafka, Stacklet is to cloud custodians. So there's now a lot of repeatability around this kind of balance between community and commercial, and it's also very great business, right? In so much as like what community can do, crowdsourcing, the power of many, is help address like the one that we're focused on. A very long tail challenge that needs the power of many to be able to address. What you can do commercially is usually get a capture around where there's the opportunity where people will pay to go faster and take less risk, like what they do when they experience our product versus the DIY.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And give us a sense of the size of the market and the type of customer that you're typically serving with Stacklet. So I'd like to also kind of within this part of the conversation get into how you funded the company and raising some capital. But let's just kind of start with size of the market here.
Yeah, look, the size of the market is varying numbers on, call it like total addressable market or TAM. So I won't just quote them, but I'll try and give you some context behind why it's a big market. So most organizations are not building, physical infrastructure anymore, or investing in physical data centers. They're predominantly using cloud services and public cloud technology. And again, driven even further in the last couple of years and faster because of the explosion around AI, right? If you want to run AI services, you're likely doing that with public cloud, and therein more likely you're going to be running your own workloads in the public cloud. So this is all not only very big today, but also exploding. And most folks will tell you, well, there's still a lot of physical data centers and a lot of organizations that are moving workloads out of those physical data centers. So it's already large, it's growing. You can look at the stats around how large AWS and Azure and GCP are doing, just to get a sense for the TAM. And it's also multi-sector, right? So, pure tech, fintech, insurance, retail, pharmaceuticals, you name it, all of these folks are adopting public cloud, adopting AI, right? So it's everybody in terms of business. And where our product starts to hit a really crisp inflection point in terms of becoming needs-based is when the organization gets somewhere between 5 to 10 million a year in public cloud spend, and certainly anything north of that, right? And what that's a proxy for is the traditional approaches towards managing infrastructure don't serve you well in public cloud anymore, right? It's almost like a change in physics problem. There's so much volume and rate of change that you need to have your controls, your best practices automated, or you'll drown in the problems that you're having in terms of insecurities, non-compliance, inefficiencies, right? You'll overspend and you'll be taking on too much risk. So that becomes super clear at that inflection point, and that what that means in terms of like our opportunity is it's all enterprise businesses across all different sectors, and then also several, folks that may be, at least in terms of like employee side, small to medium, but perhaps are very digitally native or tech forward or have made a strategic investment in cloud. And so we've got a lot of folks that can get value from our product. And now it's where I think you're going. It's a question of, getting the business to scale up to meet that demand and do that in a, effective and efficient way.
Yeah. And as far as getting the business to that point and helping it scale up, one of the reasons that we got to meet at the Hunt Ticker Fireside Convo was because we were talking about funding, and you had some unique perspectives about raising capital. To the extent you're able to share about how much you've raised and how you raised that capital, I always think that's an interesting conversation, especially within this ecosystem, because a lot of founders talk about access to capital here in Kentucky. So would love to hear your perspective on it and how you kind of went around finding funding for Stacklet.
Yep. So we've raised $36.5 million to date across 3 different funding rounds. So we did a seed round, a Series A, and then earlier this year did our Series B. So, and our journey, some of it is timing related, or there's an interesting kind of timing component because the markets have been, and just maybe the world itself has been a little bit volatile in the last 4 years. So when we actually started the business, the day we filed our paperwork was March 11th of 2020, which is the exact same day that they declared the global pandemic. So not definitely not the ideal time, but often you don't know. You don't always really know what the world you're in, right, in the moment that you're in it, right? Like that, actually, it was a pretty good time. It didn't feel like it. It was certainly nerve-wracking, but there were a lot of good things to be said about, well, we had already made plans to take the leap at that time. So there were some things that we had been doing, like on my co-founder and I just started with the 2 of us, like there are already some things that we have been doing on like our personal finance side to like build up our cash reserves. And so we weren't as exposed to when the market dipped, like some of that type of stuff. So you never know what, your fortunes are actually going to hold. But we were certainly in that early stage a little bit freaked out about, hey, this is a 1 in 100 year event that we had no semblance for and didn't know what it was going to mean for the business that we had just started. So we had originally thought about maybe doing some bootstrapping or that sort of thing. And when the COVID situation emerged, we were like, well, let's go see if we can raise, because having access to capital, if we can get it, might make this a little bit easier on the personal side. So at that time, the investors that we were interacting with in the earliest days, they didn't know what was going on. So they wouldn't, be overt about, hey, we might not be taking on investments right now, but they weren't taking on investments, at least, in the moment. But they some of this, just think about from their perspective, like, they were used to meeting people in person. Like they maybe had a whole process for like, we want to meet you in person. We want you to meet, the rest of the firm, like, and that all got disrupted because they couldn't do those things. So they had to, and perhaps some of their existing portfolio companies, if they were in a type of sector that got dramatically impacted in those earliest days, they may needed to, send, reserve capital to protect those investments or to help them get through a challenging time. So they were figuring it out. We were figuring it out. We eventually, Foundation Capital was our first money in. They are a 40, 50-year-old, very venerable Silicon Valley firm. But we were also the first one that they invested in without having ever met physically in person. So, a little bit of a sign of the times there. And then we started basically with just 2 people in a slide deck, got that initial capital, did a little bit of hiring, towards engineering, got some early like design partners, a few that were actually paying, right? So paying pre-product. These were all very good signals. Oh, by the way, we also had a strong following and a community built around the open source that had a lot of tenure around it. So we were, let's say further along perhaps than maybe your average folks. But then, we actually did another a Series A on the back of like that early traction. And that was an interesting time too. It wasn't like, necessarily the peak of maybe where the startup bubble was, but it was certainly, heading that direction. So we had great investors for the Series A, access to capital, even though maybe it was a little bit early for us. We thought we could grow very quickly with that. So we took that opportunity. Things were going really well. We did our product launch, initial one in like mid 2021. And we hit our first $1 million in revenue like 7 months after the product launch. And then, oh, by the way, this may be shocking, but when we did our initial product launch, it was very aggressive. Like parts of our product weren't, fully smoothed out. And I know that's shocking, but so we thought that this was just really great momentum. And we started staffing up a lot in 2022. But what was interesting about that time was Russia invaded Ukraine, I think in February of 2022. By like May and June, there were significant market corrections. Inflation started to creep in. Like we were trying to grow based on our momentum at a time when the rest of the world was going the opposite direction. So that caused us to basically, do some replanning. We did, some OpEx reductions, difficult time, but a lot of folks were going through the same thing. A lot of tech, basically, did the types of things that we did. In 2023, we got very, very efficient, and then we also grew very, very quickly. Right, we tripled revenue in 2023 with, let's say, very minimal investment in go-to-market, and that stood out dramatically. And one of the key, use cases was the cost optimization aspect. We could go talk to our customers and say, look at how much money we can save you and how quickly we can do it. Not only are we going to pay for ourselves, we're going to do that many times over. It was a very universal business justification at a time when people were looking for the types of optimizations that we offer, right? The thing that we can help them do is high ROI, but it's also potentially a lot of work, and depending on their view of it, can be deemed high risk. So, high is actually a very good place to have a vendor relationship if you can find one like what we do and build that kind of trust and rapport with the customers that we have. So
I guess this is a question to both of you, but what were some of the takeaways from that fireside conversation here at Hunsicker and the relationship between, raising here maybe locally? I'm guessing you haven't probably had to get any money locally compared to the coast.
Yeah. I mean, what I learned was just the access. And what I mean by that is I wasn't aware of local opportunities, right? So, and that's, I still haven't reconciled perhaps the how around that. What I mean by that is, hey, I've lived in Kentucky most of my life. Certainly, as I described, I've had a lot of jobs and have spent time outside of the state or commuting or that sort of thing. But I've been around here, and I wasn't really aware of what the startup ecosystem or the venture capital ecosystem even looked like around here. So some of it was just, yes, that exists here, and I, as an individual, need to do a better job of engaging and proacting in terms of, my network in this area and trying to make the right connections and build the relationships that might be possible here. But what I learned is that it is very possible to raise capital, to start a business here. It just may not have been super obvious to somebody like me.
Yeah. One of the other dynamics we talked about a lot that you've brought up on the podcast before, Evan, was kind of the flywheel effect that we all want to see kind of take root here in this area that has kind of happened in places like Indianapolis with the ExactTarget exit, where, a big exit happens, capital flows into the ecosystem, and then that capital kind of churns through the ecosystem in terms of angel investments and just, people with experience that have worked at a company that has gotten to a point like that. So that was one of the other interesting dynamics that we talked about, alongside just founders that are building here being able to like share their story and create awareness around what's going on here.
Yeah.
There's a lot of crossover with what we do with Middle Tech and some of the takeaways that we had from that conversation. One of the questions I had for you, Travis, that I wanted to dig into a little bit here is, you mentioned that you started the company in 2020, right as COVID hit, right as everything was going virtual. I'm curious what you view as some of the pros and cons of running a fully remote company.
Yeah.
So, what does that look like in your view?
Yeah. And I'll start off with describing how fortunate we are for the team that we have, because a lot of the folks that we have on the team, maybe from their past experiences, have worked with open source, have worked, in community technologies. And in those modalities, you don't sit next to the person that you're working with. So what that fostered for us is a very good written culture, very, call it like, good empathy for, hey, we're going to work together. We need to, in some ways, like over communicate around this or around certain topics. So there are ways, and I think we're very good at the ways that you can be hyper productive in a remote culture. Where I think there are challenges are just getting together physically in person helps with relationships, both work relationships and the personal relationships that often become signal through noise, right? In terms of, working together, right? The classic is you never know intent from the written word, right? You can read a sentence and perhaps misunderstand whether somebody was being, let's say positive or negative from just those written words, depending on your bias or the situation or that sort of thing. And often that gets easier because of, the nonverbal communication that you get from being in person, and just being able to like relate to, stuff outside of work that helps ultimately with your work relationship. So we've done there, a lot of like company get-togethers. We're trying to do even more of them. Certainly that was difficult in, the days of the earliest, days of the pandemic when, travel was a little bit restrictive, and or folks based on their personal risk choices may not have felt fully comfortable traveling. But now that things have gotten back to normal, we want to get into a better rhythm of getting folks together, and just not only the whole company, but like regionally where it makes sense to do that as well.
Yeah. And just real quick, how big is your team at this point?
Right now we are about 30,
30, nice.
But still growing that as well.
Sweet.
So reasonably sized.
Well, as we kind of wrap things up here, one of the topics I wanted to hit on briefly here is I feel like you live a very Kentucky lifestyle. Like you train horses, correct?
My wife does.
Your wife does. Yeah. So you live on a horse farm, you run a remote company. I'm just curious, why did you want to stay in Kentucky? And as a result, like what does that major lifestyle look like between running a tech company and also living, out on a horse farm and doing all this? Just to kind of touch on that for a little bit, because I think it's an interesting dynamic. It's one that's very unique to our state.
Yeah, totally. Well, maybe just like going back even further, I'm from Louisville originally, right? And I'm a suburban kid. Met my wife at UK. She is a professional athlete in dressage, horse trainer, and has been doing that her whole life. So, very passionate about it. And I think that's a great thing, right? Being connected to your passion. And it's something that we both share for different kind of like context, right? My passion for technology, her passion for equine. And, look, I think my family, a good chunk of them are still here, at least in the Louisville area. Her family is here. So we have the roots here. at least in terms of both friends and family, for a very long period of time. And like, that's important.
For sure.
Having those relationships, continuing to build the new ones, but also, maintaining and fostering the existing ones. In terms of like the farm, we made that decision. We bought that, Jesus, probably about 14 years ago. And it's, just over the Scott County border. So, technically like the Georgetown area. And it's great. I mean, I think Central Kentucky is absolutely beautiful place, one of the most beautiful places in the world. So we feel very fortunate that we can kind of like have the mixture of lifestyles. Like, I feel like it's balancing for me in a lot of ways. What I mean by that is like, well, certainly very visibly during the COVID times when everything was shut down, like I wasn't that disrupted because I, already had a little bit of like a quarantine, lifestyle. But where it's balancing is it's great to be, in city center, in, places where, there's a lot of technology. It's also very, I think, good to be able to remove yourself from that a little bit, gives you perspective. Certainly meeting people that aren't just pure technology, having, access to a diversity of folks from a diversity of different backgrounds, is a humanizing effect that I think is one of the things that's very real and very good about Kentucky. So
yeah, I love that. All right. Well, last question here. We always like ending kind of looking forward, looking into the future. I asked you this question when we had coffee and you had a great answer to it. And that is just like, where are you looking into the future, next 3 to 5 years, let's say, even greater than that if you want to, with Stacklet? Where are you wanting to see this thing go?
Yeah, look, I think Stacklet's opportunity is as large as you can possibly imagine in terms of we have a chance. We're in a big enough market. We're very well positioned in that market. We've done tremendous work until now. We can be one of those iconic, venerable type technology companies. That's the size and scale of our opportunity. So we're going to continue to passionately pursue that. What we've also learned in the past 4 years, as you heard from some of the retelling of our journey, is it may not always be about what's in our control. There are things that could certainly happen. And look, I mean, alternative types of paths aren't necessarily the worst outcome either, right? We're focused on the problem solution, our customers, our team members, and we're very, missionary about and passionate about where we're going. We'll let some of the, what the world has in store for us work itself out, right? We're going to continue to do everything that we can to have the largest outcome that we possibly can.
Well, we'll be excited to have you back on once you have that big success story and you can tell us all about the learnings from that. But Travis, thanks so much for coming on. Before we let you go here, we always just like giving any sorts of calls to actions to the audience, anybody that might be listening. So if there are any positions that you're hiring for or like types of clients that if somebody knows somebody, they could refer to you, anything like that, just real high level before we let you go, that'd be great.
Totally. Look, I think we are hiring. We're hiring across a broad swath of both engineering and go-to-market sales and marketing type positions. So if that's interesting to you, certainly would love to have a conversation. Can apply on the website, can send LinkedIn. Certainly there are a lot of ways, I think, to reach us in that regard. In terms of like customers, would love that. If you are concerned about your cloud spend or your organization's cloud spend, if you're concerned about how much risk or compliance that you may be facing in the public cloud, we can absolutely help out, and we can help out both quickly and dramatically. So we'd love to talk to anybody that might fit that profile too.
Awesome. Well, it's been great chatting. Thanks for coming on.